Hey, I'm Mike Gilliam, and welcome to Let It Rip. We come to you not from CUNY TV studios in Manhattan, but remotely as a safety precaution due to the COVID-19 crisis. Right now, most of the attention is on the upcoming election, the coronavirus pandemic, and racial reckoning. We're here and ready for a lively conversation. This is Let It Rip. The long-awaited 2020 election is rapidly approaching, and the battle lines have been drawn between the supporters of President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden. Now, many have called this the most important election of our lifetime. It plays out in the most challenging of times against the backdrop of the coronavirus pandemic, which has killed more than 200,000 Americans and wrecked the economy. The unemployment numbers are staggering, with millions out of work. Many of those who are working do so remotely. Businesses have closed. It's also a time when a racial reckoning is taking place across the land, fueled by protests following the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor at the hands of police. And now we've seen the two candidates on the debate stage. Here to help us unpack where we are in the race and all of this, we have the distinguished lecturer of urban studies, Deepak Bhargava, civil rights attorney, Norman Siegel, and former New York Governor David Paterson, the author of the new book, Black, Blind, and in Charge, a story of visionary leadership and overcoming adversity. Governor, how does what we're seeing from the White House differ from the leadership that you write about?
Well, what we're seeing from the White House is very reflective of the leadership that existed in this country for a long time, which is deny the existence of situations and wallpaper them over with flowery language and great opportunity. So, for instance, a New York Times reporter, Nicole Hannah-Jones, did a series and also a number of podcasts called The 1619 Project. And she talked about the history of slavery. Very accurate and I think important for a lot of people to read. But the more conservative outlets scolded her for doing this and said she should have actually talked about the great moments in the early American settlement. But those were the great moments, because without the intervention of people who were not happy with the way the government was acting, we wouldn't have had the Civil War. We wouldn't have had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments passed. We wouldn't have evaporated segregation. And so when President Trump got up at the debate and talked about organizations that were sponsoring the rallies that don't even exist, and denying that organizations that are well known, like the Proud Boys, are not racist, this is the way he handled the pandemic virus. He didn't want anyone to panic, so he lied to the public. Now, I'm sure there are plenty of times when all of us, not wanting someone else to panic, didn't tell them something that we could have told them. But in this case, he put people in danger by saying that you didn't really need to wear masks. He wanted to reopen the government at Easter. He fought at every turn anything that the medical professionals said to him, and in a sense, used what was the old American way of addressing issues, which is to not address them and then to pretend that they don't exist.
Gentlemen, chime in here right now. Do you think that will be the defining issue during this election, coronavirus?
Yeah, I think really democracy is on the line. I think the president showed us last night that he no longer believes that he can win this election fair and square. And so he's going to try to get us to believe that this election won't be run fair and square, and use every tool in the toolbox to undermine the integrity of the election. So I think in a way, this election has now become a referendum on the possibility of a multiracial democracy in this country. We've had it for a very short period of time. Only since the 1965 Voting Rights Act have we really had it. And he's trying to bring it to a close. And that's what this election now is about. Do we have a multiracial democracy in this country or not?
And let me jump in, Michael, with Deepak's comments. I think we advocates need to educate the public, the American public, that this will be a very different election than ever before. In the past, November 3rd at 11:59, that's when we learn who our next president is. Here, December 8th, December 14th, January 3rd, January 6th, January 20th. Those are key dates as well, as we will get into this, because I see the seeds being planted now for a few months of basically trying to create confusion, chaos, and challenges to the fairness of the election, and potentially not only winding up in the House of Representatives and the US Senate with electoral college where people don't even understand what that is. Article 2 of the US Constitution, the 12th Amendment, which most people have never even read, let alone, and then potentially going to the Senate and the House before January 20th, when is the inauguration for the next president. So folks, buckle up, get prepared. It ain't going to end on 11:59 on November 3rd.
So what if he decides Joe Biden won, but he won't leave office? He's contesting the election and he's just not going to leave. What happens then?
I think we had a very important trial run for this in 2000, where the evidence shows that Al Gore actually won the election, won the electoral votes in Florida. If there was a full statewide recount, he would have, but he conceded very early on after the Supreme Court ruling. And the Republicans brought a bunch of white male campaign staffers to Florida and ran something called a Brooks Brother riot to intimidate the people counting the ballot. They used intimidation, threat of violence, disorder and chaos to basically intimidate. And the Democrats played by kind of, the rules as they were laid down, or they thought they were laid down, played nice, essentially.
Yeah, they basically came and said, this is over.
They caved. And so for me, the key lesson here is that neither the Biden campaign, nor congressional Democrats, nor the majority of Americans who oppose this president with great fervor and passion can stand down and allow him to try to steal the election. Ultimately, democracy is us. We, the voters, need to get out and vote. We, the voters, need to stand up and protect the integrity of the ballot. It is absolutely, essentially, the ultimate thing that guarantees our democratic freedoms is ourselves.
What should other governors across the United States be doing to kind of protect themselves and democracy in their states as we look at a scenario like this kind of exploding onto us?
The fact is that there's nothing in the Constitution that says that the popular vote elects the president. So even if President Trump lost the popular vote and lost the Electoral College vote, what his people are doing right now is trying to organize the legislators in Republican states to, in a sense, remove the electors that may already be there in favor of electors who'd be more favorable to the president. And even though Biden theoretically could win some of those states, that could be reversed by the legislature, because the electors do have the freedom to vote the way they want to. And that would be a way to undermine not only the vote of the people, but even what the Electoral College is for. When you win the state, you're supposed to get all the electors. In the 1960 election between President Kennedy and the eventual President Richard Nixon, one of Nixon's delegates voted for Admiral Byrd in the Electoral College vote. Now, I don't think anybody's done that since then, but this would be the wrong year to bring back a practice such as that. So I think what the governors have got to be doing is to make sure that there are fair elections in their state, that mail balloting is allowed. No one other than President Trump has ever said that the mail balloting does work. The instance that he cited in the debate was actually the reverse of what he said. The postal worker that was caught changing the ballots was changing them from Democrat to Republican. So, it's just it's just amazing to live in this time and realize these things are happening. And it takes me back to what I was talking about before, the things that happened years ago. Americans today are almost in denial. They don't know anything about slavery, don't know anything about desegregation. They didn't do it and shouldn't be blamed for it. And yet they take full credit for the Revolutionary War and settling the land and the technology that we've developed, which a lot of it is great. But this kind of amnesia that we have about history, which we know leads to history repeating itself, we may be watching it right now.
Norman, let me ask you, legally, are we in a situation here right now where we're just helpless? I mean, there's so many mistruths and lies that are out there, and they continue to pile them on top of each other. It almost feels like we're just being steamrolled in a situation where we know that this administration is going to cheat during this election. Do we have any recourse here?
I think the first thing, as I mentioned before, is that the public needs to know what their rights are. It needs to know what the ground rules are, and if necessary, go to court in order to enforce those rights. So let me give you the troubling scenarios. On November 3rd, because of what David and Deepak have talked about, the Electoral College, the custom has always been in the past, although 1876, Tilden versus Rutherford was another bad example. And in 2000, Bush versus Gore. But in 2000, it was only one state, Florida, that was in question. In 2020, we could have a half a dozen states with the following troubling scenario. On the day of the election, the Republican candidate seems to have the lead. But because of the absentee ballots coming in 3 days, 5 days later, the blue shift begins to come in. And what that's about is that it appears that more Democrats do absentee balloting, universal mail-in, than Republicans. So if that happens, you could see where people begin, especially the supporters of the Republican candidate, believe that it's fixed, it's rigged. And that's what Trump has been planting seeds for 2 or 3 months about. If there's a split there, man, we've got a constitutional crisis, because the Constitution, in my opinion, doesn't really directly address this. That's why I think he's absolutely right that what's at stake here is enormous. It's democracy in its pure form.
Well, we're in for quite an election, and no matter who wins, things promise to be very divided even after Election Day. I want to thank our guest, distinguished lecturer of urban studies, Deepak Bhargava, civil rights attorney, Norman Siegel, and former New York Governor David Paterson, the author of the new book, Black, Blind, and in Charge. Thank you all. We're going to take a short break before getting into the controversy surrounding the Breonna Taylor case. But first, a word about the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I want to take a moment and remember her and her many contributions. Ginsburg served with distinction for 27 years on the nation's highest court, but before that, she was already a star in the legal field, where she has been referred to as the architect of the battle for women's rights. Before her first judicial appointment, Ginsburg led the fight for women's rights. Up until that point, women faced extreme hurdles. State and local laws restricted what women could do, what jobs they could hold, their rights. It's hard to believe, but women were even banned from serving on juries. That all changed because Ginsburg fought the legal battles. One of the biggest victories was when she wrote the Supreme Court's opinion barring the Virginia Military Institute from remaining all male. The road to the Supreme Court was a long one that began in Brooklyn, where Ruth Bader attended public schools. She went on to Cornell University, where she would meet the love of her life and future husband, Marty Ginsburg. She eventually attended Harvard Law School. Marty graduated, got a job in New York. She transferred to Columbia for her final year of law school and excelled, but still faced job discrimination. Because she was a woman, she fought that discrimination, often persuading the courts that the 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection, not just to minorities, but also to women. President Jimmy Carter appointed her to the U.S. Court of Appeals, and in 1993, she was nominated to the Supreme Court by President Bill Clinton. She survived 5 bouts of cancer, yet continued to fight the good fight. Ruth Bader Ginsburg died at her Washington home at the age of 87.
You're watching CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Welcome back to Let It Rip. I'm Mike Gilliam. The Breonna Taylor case has become a flashpoint for those seeking social justice. Taylor was shot and killed in her home in Louisville by officers serving a no-knock search warrant in a drug investigation in the middle of the night. Taylor and her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, say they were in bed watching TV when cops knocked down the door. Walker says he fired one shot from a licensed handgun at the men coming in, who he says he didn't know were cops. They say they returned fire. Breonna Taylor was hit 6 times and died. One cop suffered a leg wound. None of the 3 officers that fired their guns a total of 20 times was charged directly with Breonna's death. One detective, Brett Hankinson, was charged with 3 counts of wanton endangerment for shots fired blindly into the apartment that entered another unit. We have attorney and writer Malaika Jabali, human rights attorney Kiru Gushuru, who is also a graduate student at City College, and civil rights and criminal defense lawyer Ron Kuby. Welcome. Ron, let's start with you. They say they're going to release the grand jury transcripts. How important is that?
Ultimately, I don't think it's going to make any difference, in the sense that I don't think it's going to change the minds of the people who have already made up their minds about this case. And the problem here in this case, and it's difficult to say, but everybody in this case acted lawfully. And that is precisely the problem here. This wasn't Eric Garner being choked to death in an illegal chokehold. This was not George Floyd being tortured for 9 minutes, and every person, any rational person, would say, this has got to be illegal. What happened here, step by step, was lawful, and that's the problem. This is not a case of 1 bad cop or 2 bad cops or 4 bad cops. This is a case that cries out for systemic reform of the criminal justice system, the way people get policed. And so I don't think the grand jury minutes, I don't think they're going to change any minds.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you say that everyone acted lawfully, are you talking about the fact that that shot was fired before police fired?
I'm talking about the police had probable cause to believe that there was drug activity in the address that they had targeted, which was the Taylor home. It was wrong information. It was outdated information, but it was not crazy, unreasonable information.
Malaika?
Yes, if everything that the police officers claimed happened, then it is lawful. But there have also been reports. There was a investigation that showed that the ballistics report didn't actually show that Breonna Taylor's boyfriend shot the officer who was one of the officers who fired the rounds. So I think as a journalist and also as a public policy attorney, I'm always very mindful about what police reports say and what the media reports about what police say, because we know that they have a priority. Their priority is to basically shoot first and ask questions later. And often what the facts don't actually align with what happened. So I just want to clarify that, because that's relatively new information that came out this week. Yeah. On top of that, if we think about what happens with Black women, yes, our stories are not told as much. And I also want to shout out my professor. That campaign, the Say Her Name campaign, came from an attorney and a scholar, a legal scholar, who also coined the term intersectionality, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw from Columbia University. So she started the Say Her Name campaign through the African American Policy Forum. And one of the things that they have really tried to show is that Black women experience various forms of oppression. We experience intersecting experiences with classism, racism, and sexism. And the fact that we do not hone in and highlight Black women who are experiencing violence is an element of that quote unquote misogynoir. It's misogyny mixed with racism, and Black women experience traffic stops more than any other group of women. And so while Black men do experience police violence at higher rates than anybody else, that is something that we do need to be clear about, the criminalization of Black men is a very unique thing that they experience. But we also do have criminalization of Black women, and that's what the Say Her Name campaign is about. So on top of criminalizing Black women, they went to what they thought was her apartment. You also get a little bit less sympathy. You get people who ask, well, what did she do wrong? So that's the sexism coming into play. What did she do wrong? Why did she attract this? What was she doing in her life? Kind of what you hear about what happens with rape victims. So we tend to victim blame, and we also don't give them the same respect and appreciation that we might give other victims.
Mm-hmm. Kira, what do you think about all of this?
I think just to follow up with regard to what Malaika just indicated, you know, if you look at the inconsistencies, even with the incident report that was filed with the by the police officers, initially they said that they were able to arrest Jamarcus Glover at 12. Then they came back and changed it to 12:40, which was around the same time that they went and you know, headed into Breonna Taylor's apartment. In addition to that, if you look at the incident report, it indicated that Breonna Taylor was not injured. And that there was no physical damage caused to the property. So following up on all that, the police inconsistencies, I think, warrant great scrutiny, because there's just no way that you could trust exactly what they did leading up to where we are now with the grand jury. The grand juror who said that you have to go ahead and release the grand jury minutes in order to substantiate some of the things that Daniel Cameron said on a news release. So I think, you know, there's a very legitimate issue here in terms of getting to whether the police are actually telling the truth when it comes to how they treated Breonna Taylor.
You have other questions about the case, Ron?
Well, you know, I don't at this point. I sort of started out assuming that almost everything the police said to explain their behavior is a lie. I started out, you know, assuming, as Malaika suggested, that the most likely explanation for the leg wound suffered by the officer was friendly fire, as so often ends up being the case. That, of course, doesn't change the self-defense equation, because when you're in a position of using deadly physical force, you don't have to be right. You just have to reasonably believe it. And the shot that Breonna Taylor's boyfriend fired, again, perfectly legally, from a perfectly legal gun, gave them the justification they needed to open up the way they did.
This case is playing out against the backdrop of this presidential election right now, and it has generated many, many protests. And one of the things that I've been concerned about is that while you do have protests, those on the right are taking those protests and trying to say if there's any violence there, that's a problem with Black Lives Matter. It's a violent organization, that sort of thing. And it almost feels like a trap has been set. You know, anyone could cause violence at one of those protests, and suddenly here they come. They're coming for your suburbs, and all of that becomes like the rhetoric you hear from the right. What do you guys make of all that?
Violence and fear mongering that comes from conservatives. This is something that we see if we, you know, even go before Colin Kaepernick. This is something that they were doing to Martin Luther King, the Prince of Peace. So you had cartoons, political cartoons that were coming out during the Selma campaign, S-E-L-M-A. I'm a little country, so I didn't mean to say Selma. But out of the Selma campaign, they were political cartoons that was mocking Martin Luther King's stance on nonviolence and showing kind of chaos in the background and saying, oh, this is what you mean by a nonviolent protest, not telling you that it's white vigilantes and white reactionaries who were starting the violence. And so I think we have to reframe when we even use the word violence in the first place. Is armed resistance, is lighting, as you know, as much as that might scare people, as much as small business owners should have their property not damaged if, you know, they're struggling small business owners. I think we can understand that argument. But at the same time, even in the worst case scenario, if you are lighting a empty car lot on fire, is that worse than the violence of white vigilantes murdering 2 people or killing 2 people? Because we still, you know, we don't have any indictments in that or any charges in those cases, but you have white vigilantes who are actually killing people. You have police officers who are killing people. So the violence that we need to be talking about, the violence in our inner cities, is the violence coming out of police, guns, and these white vigilantes.
Well, the tensions surrounding racism and policing are so thick that it feels like you could cut it with a knife, and calling for law and order without any compassion or effort to at least recognize the problem is like throwing gas on an already burning fire. And that's what we kind of are getting from the administration. I want to thank our guests, attorney and writer Maleka Jabali, human rights attorney Kira Bushuro, who is also a graduate student at City College, and civil rights and criminal defense lawyer Ron Kuby. We're going to take a short break, and I'll be back with some final thoughts. I'm Mike Gilliam, and this is Let It Rip.
You're watching CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Welcome back to Let It Rip. I'm Mike Gilliam. Now for some final thoughts. And it's a message that we should all be sharing on our social media. This is the most important election in our lives. Register and vote. If you haven't voted in the past, you can see what that got you. Every day, the stakes become clearer and clearer. There's a movement, but for it to grow to fruition, those who would block it have to be moved out of the way, voted out of office, and replaced by people who are unified in wanting the best for all of us in this country. Go online to your Board of Elections site and see what the deadlines are. Find out the deadline to register. Learn about absentee voting and early voting. Don't miss the deadlines, and tell others too. It's important that your vote gets counted. People shed blood and died to get the right. Don't misuse it. That's it for this episode of Let It Rip. I'm Mike Gilliam. Thanks for joining us. Stay safe and vote.